The night sky split open with a crack that shook the earth itself. Lightning painted the drowned world in stark white and shadow, while the swollen Bitter Creek River transformed into a churning beast that devoured the Dakota Territory prairie whole. Fence posts spun past like matchsticks. The bloated carcass of a steer tumbled in the current, grotesque and terrible. And cutting through it all, a small buffalo-hide bullboat borrowed that morning from the upriver trading post fought the raging water with desperate purpose. Rose Harper clung to the roof ridge of what had been her family's cabin, her fingers white-knuckled on the wet shingles. 24 years old, a homesteader's daughter who had crossed half a continent for this, a plot of bottomland along Bitter Creek, and now the land itself was trying to kill her. The cabin groaned beneath her like a dying animal, timbers splitting with sounds like rifle shots. Water lapped at her boots, climbing inch by relentless inch. Through the sheets of rain, she saw him. The Lakota scout paddling with controlled fury against the current, his lean frame bent to the work. Takala. She had seen him in Fire Creek, trading at the Mercantile, helping at Doc Pike's office, always quiet and capable. Now he was her only chance at survival. Hold on. His voice cut through the thunder, clear and commanding. The boat scraped against a massive cottonwood branch wedged against the cabin's sagging eaves. He braced the vessel with one hand, extending the other toward her. Rain poured down his face, streaming from the two braids that hung past his shoulders. Now jump before it shifts. Rose didn't think. Thinking would have paralyzed her. She lunged across the gap, her boots slipping on the wet shingles, her body suspended over black water for one terrible instant. Then his hand closed around her wrist, strong, sure, unyielding, and he hauled her across the void. She tumbled into the boat in a graceless sprawl. The bullboat rocked violently, shipping water threatening to capsize. Takala moved with liquid speed, shifting his weight to compensate, pulling her hard against his chest to steady them both. His arm came around her back, anchoring her as the boat spun in the current. Down. He pushed her low as a fence post shot past, missing her skull by inches. His buckskin coat came off his shoulders in one smooth motion and settled over her, still warm from his body, despite being soaked through. His hands adjusted the collar with practiced efficiency, shielding her neck from the driving rain. For a heartbeat, they were face to face, so close she could see the water droplets caught in his dark eyelashes, could feel his breath warm against her frozen cheek. His eyes met hers with an intensity that cut through her fear, a wordless communication that said, "I have you, you're safe, we survived this together." Then the current seized them like a giant's hand and spun the boat downstream toward the shattered remains of Jensen's corral, where fence posts jutted from the foam like teeth waiting to devour them. Takala dug the paddle-deep muscles coiling beneath his wet shirt, fighting for control. Behind them, the Harper cabin finally surrendered to the flood, with a groaning crash that sounded like the end of the world. 3 days earlier, Fire Creek had been merely struggling, not dying. The town sat in the broad valley where Bitter Creek meandered through Dakota Territory, a settlement of perhaps 200 souls scattered along a single muddy main street. It was spring in the year 1874. 3 years after the territorial government had opened the land to homesteading, and the creek was running dangerously high. Snowmelt from the distant Black Hills had swollen it to the very top of its banks, turning the usually lazy brown trickle into a muscular current that worried the old-timers who remembered previous floods. But it held. The water stayed between its banks, and life went on with the grinding determination that characterized frontier existence. Rose Harper stood at the town pump that morning, working the iron handle with steady rhythm, while her 10-year-old sister Clara struggled to hold the bucket steady. The spring sun was warm on Rose's shoulders, a pleasant contrast to the icy water splashing over her hands. She wore her second-best dress, the good calico with only 2 patches, because Papa was at the land office, and Mama insisted they present themselves properly in town. "It's heavy," Clara complained, the bucket sloshing. "Then brace your legs. You're strong enough if you try." Clara scowled but adjusted her stance, and the bucket steadied. Rose smiled despite herself. Her sister was all stubborn determination wrapped in pigtails and freckles. "Let me take that." Rose turned at the voice. Takala stood behind her, leading his paint horse by the reins. He was perhaps 27 or 28, with the lean, hard-muscled build of a man who lived by physical work and long miles. His face was all clean lines, straight nose, strong jaw, high cheekbones, marked by a thin scar that ran along the left side from temple to chin. His hair hung in 2 thick braids, wrapped with strips of red cloth, and he wore an odd combination of white man's canvas trousers and a traditional buckskin shirt decorated with intricate quill work. He lifted the heavy water barrel Rose had been preparing to fill as though it weighed nothing, positioning it under the spout without being asked. "Thank you kindly," Rose said, resuming her pumping. Water gushed from the spout. "That's neighborly of you." "River's running high." His English was fluent but carefully pronounced. He glanced toward the creek, visible beyond the row of false-fronted buildings. "Higher than I've seen in 7 springs. Maybe 8. Papa says it'll crest soon and start dropping. Always does." "Maybe." Takala's dark gaze returned to her face, assessing. "You're the Harper family. The new claim past Jensen's place on the bottomland." "That's right. Came out from Illinois last fall." Rose paused in her work. "You're Tokala, the scout. I've seen you at Doc Pike's." "I help him when I can. Carry supplies, translate when Lakota come for medicine." Something shifted in his expression. "Keep your family to high ground if the water keeps rising. The bottomland floods fast when it goes." It was good advice, the kind a careful man gives when he sees danger others might miss. Rose found herself studying his face, the scar, the deep-set eyes that seemed to miss nothing. "I'll remember," she said quietly. "Thank you." He nodded once and led his horse toward Kind Kate's mercantile. Rose watched him go, conscious of a strange flutter in her chest. Clara tugged her sleeve. "Mama's waiting, and you're staring." "I'm not staring. I'm thinking. About the scout. About minding our business," Rose said firmly, though her cheeks burned. Fire Creek in the spring of 1874 was a typical frontier settlement, raw, muddy built, to last until something better could be afforded. The main street was lined with structures ranging from solid log construction to ramshackle tar paper shanties. There was Kind Kate's mercantile, the land office, a telegraph station manned by nervous young Pavel, 2 saloons, a livery stable, Doc Reginald Pike's office, and a schoolhouse that doubled as a church on Sundays, presided over by Sabrina Whitlow, the sharp-tongued schoolteacher from Philadelphia. At the far western edge of town, Frank Mallory's ranch headquarters sprawled across 100 acres. Frank himself was a thick-bodied man in his early 50s, with a florid face and the blunt manner of someone who'd built an empire through force of will. The cowhands called him Fat Frank behind his back, but never to his face. He'd come west during the gold rush years, made his fortune supplying miners, and parlayed that into land thousands of acres along Bitter Creek that he controlled through legitimate purchase and aggressive claim jumping. Now he wanted more. That afternoon, Rose learned troubling news from Sabrina Whitlow as they sorted donated books in the church vestry. "Frank's pushing a diversion ditch through the county board," Sabrina said bluntly. "Claims it'll protect the town from flooding, but the route would wash out every settler claim on the bottomland, including yours." Rose felt her stomach drop. "Can he do that?" "Out here, men with money do what they want. The law bends their direction." Sabrina's green eyes flashed with anger. If that ditch goes through and the creek floods, your lease gets voided. Then Frank files on the land himself at a fraction of its value. That's theft. It's called business on the frontier, and there's not much we can do about it. The words sat heavy in Rose's chest as she walked home that evening. The Harper claim was everything her father had worked for 160 acres of fertile bottomland, leased from Frank with an option to purchase after 3 years of improvements. Abraham had sunk their life savings into it. If they lost it to flooding. That evening, as Rose helped her mother Greta prepare supper, Pavel the telegraph boy appeared at the door. He was 18, all gangly limbs and nervous energy. Now he thrust a folded scrap of paper into Rose's hand with shaking fingers. "Saw something odd," Pavel whispered. "Fat Frank's been buying supplies from One-Eyed Sam. Blasting powder caps fuse line. More than a man needs for clearing stumps, and his crew's been working nights upstream. Thought you should know." He vanished before Rose could thank him. She unfolded the paper, a list of purchases in Pavel's cramped handwriting. Her blood went cold. Why would Frank need explosives, and why work at night she should tell someone? But who would believe her? And what proof did she have beyond a nervous boy's word? As Rose stood in the doorway, watching the sun set over Bitter Creek Valley, watching the swollen creek rolling past with sullen power, she felt the first real prickle of unease work its way down her spine. The sky was piling up with clouds to the west. Huge thunderheads, the color of old bruises, shot through with veins of lightning. A storm was coming. The storm hit at dusk with the fury of divine wrath. It began with scattered drops, then built rapidly into a torrent that turned the world gray. Thunder rolled without pause. Lightning walked across the prairie in brilliant white sheets. Inside the Harper cabin, Abraham checked their supplies, while Greta settled Clara into bed. Rose sat at the rough plank table, unable to shake her unease. Pavel's note seemed to burn in her pocket. The explosion came at midnight. It was a dull crump felt more than heard, muffled by distance and rain. Then a rumble that grew and grew, building like a freight train, shaking the cabin's walls. Abraham threw open the door and stood frozen, staring upstream. "Sweet mercy," he breathed. A wall of water was coming. Rose didn't understand it, and then didn't know that the earthen dam at Widow's Well had been breached, didn't know it was anything but terrible misfortune. She only knew that death was bearing down on them with unstoppable force. "Wagon!" Abraham roared. "Move now." They scrambled. Greta snatched Clara from bed. Abraham ran for the barn, already ankle-deep in water. Rose helped him harness the mule team with hands that shook. The animals were mad with terror. They threw what they could into the wagon blankets, clothes, the shotgun. Greta climbed up with Clara. Abraham took the reins. Rose was climbing aboard when she heard it, a thin, desperate wail cutting through the storm. A child's voice from the Jensen cabin 200 yards away. "Rose, get in!" Abraham shouted. "Ulrika Jensen, she's trapped. We can't, Rose." But Rose was already running. She splashed through water that went from knee-deep to thigh-deep in seconds. Behind her, Abraham cursed and whipped the mules. The wagon lurched forward. He had no choice. Clara was screaming, and the water was rising by the second. He assumed Rose would catch up. He was wrong. Rose reached the Jensen cabin and hauled herself through a window. Water poured in behind her, shockingly cold. Ulrika, 6 years old with blonde braids, was pinned under a fallen beam. Rose grabbed the beam and heaved with everything she had, managing to shift it enough for the girl to wriggle free. Up the ladder. Go. They climbed to the loft, then through a hatch onto the steep roof. The moment Rose emerged into the hammering rain, she understood the full horror. The cabin stood in a lake that stretched to every horizon. Debris spun past trees, buildings, a wagon wheel, the carcass of a cow. And there in the distance, her family's wagon was a tiny shape, disappearing downstream. "Mama!" Ulrika wailed. "Hush, baby. Hold tight to me." Rose wrapped both arms around the child and anchored them to the ridge beam. The cabin shuddered, groaning. They were going to die here. Rose closed her eyes and prayed. And then, impossibly, she heard a voice. "Hold on." A bullboat was coming, cutting through debris. Tokala paddled it with desperate power. He'd been at Hawk's Roost when the flood hit and had immediately launched to rescue stranded souls. He'd already saved 15 people. Now he saw 2 more. Hold on. He maneuvered through debris that could gut his boat, bringing it alongside as the cabin groaned. The child first. He braced against a broken post. Rose lifted Ulrika and shoved her toward the boat. Tokala grabbed the girl and set her in the center, wrapping her in canvas. Then he reached for Rose. "Now jump!" Rose lunged. The roof gave way beneath her. For one terrible instant, she was suspended over black water. Then Tokala's hand closed around her wrist like iron. He hauled her across the gap with one powerful pull. She tumbled into the boat ungainly as a sack of grain, nearly capsizing them. Tokala shifted his weight, instantly pulling her against his chest, pinning her there with one arm while steadying the boat. His heart hammered against her back. For 3 heartbeats, they stayed like that, balanced on the knife edge between survival and drowning. "Breathe with me," he said quietly. Slow. In and out. Rose forced herself to focus on the rise and fall of his chest, the steady rhythm. Her panicked gasps slowed. She nodded, and he carefully released her. His coat came off soaked, but warmer than her dress, and he draped it over her and Ulrika, tucking it around them. "Hold the child. We move fast now." He dug the paddle into water, and the boat leaped forward. Debris whirled past. Then a shape loomed, a steer crazed with panic, thrashing through the flood. Down. The steer hit the boat broadside with stunning force. One horn punched through the hide, tearing a gash. The impact threw Rose sideways. She would have gone overboard if Tokala hadn't lunged, catching her with his body. Water poured through the torn hide. The boat settled lower, riding inches above sinking. Tokala bent to the paddle with renewed fury, his shoulders bunching beneath wet fabric. Rain streamed down his face, but he didn't slow. Rose clutched his coat around herself, and Ulrika, feeling the residual warmth, smelling wood smoke and sage. And through the terror, she felt fierce gratitude, not just for the rescue, but for the man himself. His competence, his strength, the way he moved through chaos with sureness. She looked up at his face, illuminated by lightning, and thought, "I don't know you, but I owe you everything." The current seized them with malicious intent, spinning the boat downstream faster than any paddle could control. Tokala fought to keep them pointed forward, but the floodwater dragged them toward a submerged fence line where posts jutted like broken teeth. "Paddle left side," he shouted. Rose had never handled a boat, but desperation made her quick. She shoved Ulrika down, grabbed the spare paddle and dug in on the left, while Tokala worked the right. The boat veered, narrowly missing the fence, but the violent turn shipped more water. They were riding dangerously low, the rim barely 6 inches above waterline. A massive cottonwood, uprooted and spinning, bore down from upstream. Its branches were thick as a man's body, heavy enough to crush them. Tokala saw it coming and made a split-second choice. He turned them to meet it head-on rather than let it broadside them. Brace. The tree hit with stunning force. The bow crumpled inward, willow ribs snapping. Water poured over the rim. Ulrika screamed. Rose lost her grip on the paddle. It was torn away, and vanished. They were spinning out of control, the boat half full of water. Tokala lunged for Ulrika, pulling her against his chest with one arm while fighting the current with the other. But they were going over. Rose could feel it. Then a voice bellowed, "Line, grab the line." Rose turned. A cluster of people clung to a massive root ball lodged against a sandbar. Among them was Lars Jensen, Ulrika's father, a broad-shouldered Swedish farmer with terror and hope on his weathered face. He had a rope one end secured to the roots and was spinning the other end in a wide loop. Now. Lars hurled the rope. It snaked through air. Rose threw herself forward and caught it, barely, her numb fingers closing on the rough hemp. She looped it around her wrist and hauled with everything she had. "Pull!" she screamed. Tokala dug his paddle in. Slowly, agonizingly, the boat swung toward the root ball. The current fought them every inch. Hands reached out. Lars, an older woman, a teenage boy. They grabbed the boat's rim and dragged it to safety. Tokala lifted Ulrika out first, passing her to her father, who crushed her to his chest with a sob. Then strong hands hauled Rose onto the slick wood. She collapsed, gasping, her palms raw and bleeding, but alive. "Thank you," Lars choked out, still holding Ulrika. His face was streaked with tears. "My wife, she was in the barn when it hit. I couldn't reach her." His voice broke. Tokala gripped the man's shoulder briefly, a gesture of shared grief that needed no words. Then he turned to assess the others, 7 people total, all soaked and shivering. The root ball shuddered beneath them. "Anyone hurt?" His voice cut through with calm authority. "Twisted ankle," said the older woman, kind Kate from the mercantile. "But I can walk. Boxwood Telegraph Station is on high ground, maybe a mile downstream. There's shelter. But this snag won't hold when the main surge comes. We need to move." As if to punctuate his words, the root ball lurched. A grinding sound came from beneath anchor roots tearing loose. Rose forced herself to stand. Every muscle screamed. But she saw Tokala moving with focused efficiency, checking the damaged boat, and she couldn't let him do it alone. She stepped close, steadying herself with a hand on his arm. "You're bleeding." He glanced down at the dark stain spreading across his ribs, a gouge where the steer's horn had grazed him. "It's nothing." "It's not nothing. Sit." For a moment he looked like he might argue. Then he nodded and sank onto the roots. Rose tore a strip from her petticoat and pressed it against the wound. He winced, but didn't pull away. She bound the makeshift bandage, her face close to his. "You came back," she said quietly. "Through all that, you came back for us. You needed help." His voice was matter-of-fact, but his eyes held hers with intensity. "That's reason enough." Rose felt something shift in her chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with the cold rain. She nodded, unable to find words, and finished tying the bandage. Her fingers lingered on his side for a heartbeat longer than necessary. His hand came up, hovering just beside hers, not quite touching. "Rose," he said, and her name in his mouth sounded like a promise. Then the root ball lurched violently, breaking free. Everyone in Tokala was on his feet instantly. Now, they piled into the swamped boat, far too many for its capacity. It was suicide, but staying was certain death. Tokala pushed off. They were in the current again, riding so low that every ripple sent water slopping over the sides. "Paddle together," Tokala said calmly. "Rose with me. Everyone else use your hands. Left, right, left, right." Rose matched his rhythm, her blistered hands screaming. But she didn't stop. None of them did. And slowly, impossibly, they began to make headway, angling toward Boxwood on the ridge ahead. Behind them, the root ball tore free and vanished downstream, swallowed by the flood. They reached Boxwood just as darkness fell. The ridge rose 20 feet above the flooded valley. The telegraph station, a sturdy log building, glowed with lamplight and belched smoke from its stovepipe. Inside the station was packed with refugees. 30 or 40 people huddled around a potbelly stove or lay on the floor. The air reeked of wet wool and wood smoke and fear. Pavel stood at his instrument table, tapping out messages, his young face drawn. He looked up as Rose entered, and relief flooded his features. "Harper, your folks made it to Pine Needle Ridge. Your pa's half out of his mind looking for you." Rose's knees nearly buckled. "They're safe, Clara. Got through on a log raft with a dozen others. Doc Pike's there setting bones." Pavel's hands shook. "It's bad, Rose. Bodies in the water building's gone. Whole family's just gone." Takala's hand found Rose's shoulder, a steady pressure. "Your family survived. Hold to that." Around them, people were crying, praying, or staring with hollow eyes. Kind Kate appeared with wool blankets. "Get dry. There's weak coffee by the stove." But Rose couldn't think about comfort, because as she stood there, she remembered Pavel's note about the explosives. And suddenly, standing in a room full of people who'd lost everything, a terrible suspicion began to form. What if this wasn't just bad luck? What if someone had caused this? She pulled Pavel aside, keeping her voice low. "Pavel, that note you gave me about Frank buying explosives, did you ever see what he did with them?" Pavel's eyes went wide. "You think no?" "No, this was just the storm, Rose. The dam at Widow's Well gave way, but that's natural. Old earthworks fail all the time." "Do they fail at midnight in the middle of a storm, right when it would cause maximum damage?" Pavel's face went pale. I don't know. But accusing Frank Mallory of mass murder, Rose, that's insane," she finished. "I know, maybe I'm wrong. But if I'm right and we do nothing, he gets away with it." Takala had drifted close enough to hear. His expression was unreadable. "You suspect deliberate sabotage." "I don't know what I suspect. But those explosives could be coincidence," Takala said slowly. "Or could be evidence. Only one way to find out." "How?" "The land office. If Frank planned this, there'll be signs. Records, filing claims, purchase receipts, paper trails." Rose felt her heart hammering. "The land office is half flooded." "Then we go in carefully." Takala's eyes held hers. "But if you're wrong, we're risking everything for nothing. And if you're right, we're making an enemy of the most powerful man in the territory." Rose thought of her family's claim of Ulrika's mother, crushed in the barn, of all the people who would never see justice if no one looked for it. "I have to know. Even if I'm wrong, I have to know." "Then we go together," Takala said quietly. They slipped out of the telegraph station into the rain-dark night. The land office sat at the ridge's eastern edge, a squat log building with shuttered windows. Water lapped at its foundation. Takala tried the door. Locked. He drew his knife and worked the latch, a skill learned from years of moving quietly through places he wasn't supposed to be. The lock clicked. The door swung inward. They slipped inside. The office was a disaster. Water covered the floor, ankle-deep, murky with mud. Papers floated like pale leaves. Filing cabinets stood, canted drawers half open. Rose waded to the main desk, where a ledger book lay open, its pages waterlogged and curling. She bent over it, squinting in the faint light from the window. At first, she saw only routine entries: land sales, filing fees, survey costs. Then her eye caught something. A line item dated 4 days prior, One-Eyed Sam Hardware. 20 blasting caps, 4 F'd fuse, $15. Rose's heart began to pound. Takala, look at this. He moved to her side, studying the entry. Could still be legitimate, clearing stumps like he claimed. Maybe, but look below. 2 more entries, both dated 3 days before the storm draft claim. Harper Bottomland, Section 12, 160 acres. Filing pending. Draft claim, Jensen Property, Section 11, 160 acres. Filing pending. Rose felt the blood drain from her face. He filed claims on our land before the flood. Before it happened. How could he know? Unless he planned it. Takala finished grimly. This is proof of premeditation. Rose's hands shook as she lifted the ledger carefully. We have to get this to a judge. Someone honest. Someone who... The door slammed open. 3 men filled the frame, all carrying rifles. At their head was Bison Bill Frank Mallory's foreman, a hulking brute with a scarred face and broken nose. Well, well, Bill drawled, leveling his Winchester, 1866. Trespassing on Mr. Mallory's property, that's a serious offense. This is a public land office. Rose said, her voice steadier than she felt. Not anymore. Mr. Mallory just purchased it. Bill's grin showed broken teeth. Everything in here belongs to him now, including that ledger you're holding. Takala's hand moved fractionally toward his Colt 1860 Army revolver. Bill cocked his rifle with an audible click. I wouldn't. The tension stretched taut. Rose's hand drifted toward the small revolver Doc Pike had given her, tucked into her belt beneath her coat. 3 armed men against 2 refugees. The odds weren't good. Then Takala did something unexpected. He lunged not at Bill but to the side, grabbing a filing cabinet and heaving it over. It crashed down, blocking the doorway, and in that instant of confusion, he grabbed Rose's hand. Window now. They ran. Rose clutched the ledger to her chest as Takala smashed through the shuttered back window with his shoulder. Glass shattered. They tumbled out into the rain and ran into the darkness, gunshots cracking behind them. They didn't stop running until they'd put half a mile between themselves and Boxwood, stumbling through mud and standing water, their lungs burning. Finally, they collapsed behind a jumble of boulders, gasping. Rose checked the ledger, miraculously still intact despite everything. We have proof, she panted. We have actual proof that Frank Mallory murdered 40 people for their land. We have proof, Takala agreed. Now we just have to live long enough to deliver it. They couldn't return to Boxwood. Bill would have men searching. So they struck out cross-country, heading south toward Four Corners, the county seat 30 miles away, where Judge Blackwell had chambers. The judge was known to be honest, a rarity on the frontier. By dawn, they reached the remains of Fire Creek proper. The devastation was almost incomprehensible. Buildings stood canted or collapsed entirely. Bodies lay in the mud, animals and people both. Rose turned her face away, but Takala stopped at each one, checking for life, closing eyes, murmuring prayers. They found Doc Pike at the schoolhouse clinic, which occupied the town's highest point. He was setting a trapper's compound fracture while kind Kate, who'd apparently arrived ahead of them, assisted. Pike glanced up when they entered, his weathered face haggard. Harper, Takala. Good, I need hands. We can't stay, Rose said. She showed him the ledger, explaining quickly. Pike's jaw tightened as he listened. When she finished, he nodded grimly. Sabrina Whitlow came through 2 hours ago. She suspected something similar and raided Commissioner Wendell's office during the chaos. Got this. He produced a folded paper, a carefully copied ledger page showing Wendell's accounts with a $400 payment from Frank, clearly documented, dated the same week as the ditch approval. This is bribery to approve the ditch, Rose breathed, combined with our evidence. It's enough to hang him. Pike finished. "If you can get it to Judge Blackwell alive. Frank knows you have evidence by now. He'll send everything he has to stop you." "We'll manage," Takala said. Pike handed him a second revolver. "My horse is behind the building. One horse between you is better than none. And take this." He gave Rose a small bottle. "Laudanum. If either of you gets hurt bad, it'll keep you going long enough to finish the job." They took Pike's bay gelding and rode double Tokala in the saddle rows behind him, with her arms around his waist for balance. The horse moved at a steady trot along the freight road toward Four Corners. They rode in silence for the first hour, staying alert for pursuit. The prairie stretched around them deceptively peaceful now that the rain had stopped. But the destruction was everywhere drowned. Cattle shattered wagons, collapsed cabins. "Why did you come back?" Rose asked suddenly. "At the Jensen cabin. You could have stayed safe." Takala was quiet for a long moment. Then, "My mother drowned in a flood when I was 8. Spring melt in the Black Hills. She was gathering firewood too close to the creek. The water came fast. I was too small to help, couldn't even swim. I watched her go under." His voice was flat, but Rose could hear old pain underneath. "I swore I'd never watch someone drown again if I could stop it." Rose tightened her arms around his waist, pressing her cheek briefly against his back. "I'm sorry. That's a heavy burden. It's an old one. I'm used to it." He glanced back and their eyes met. "You risked your life for the Jensen child. That's worth something. More than something. So did you. For all of us." They rode on. By early evening, they reached Stony Creek Depot, a cluster of weathered buildings where the road forked. The depot master, a grizzled man named Tuck, eyed them with suspicion until Tokala explained their mission. Tuck's expression shifted to grim approval. "Fat Frank's men came through 3 hours back asking after you. Told 'em you'd gone west. But they'll figure the lie soon." He gestured toward a handcar on the narrow-gauge rail line to Four Corners. "Take it. Pump hard and you'll be there by midnight. The trestle at Jackrabbit Crossing's still standing. Once you're across, consider damaging it so they can't follow." They climbed onto the handcar, gripping the pump handles. Rose on one side, Tokala on the other. They began working in rhythm, and the car rolled forward, picking up speed. The work was brutal. Rose's hands began bleeding within minutes, but she gritted her teeth and kept pumping. Beside her, Tokala moved like a machine, his face set. They didn't speak, and there was no breath for words, but their eyes met occasionally, sharing silent determination and something deeper. As they approached a curve, Tokala suddenly stiffened. "Stop." Rose released the handle. The handcar coasted to a halt. "Riders, behind us." He pointed. In the distance, a plume of dust rose. Horsemen riding hard. "Frank's men." Rose breathed. "We need to move faster." They bent to the handles again, pumping with desperate speed. A rifle shot cracked. The bullet sang past wide, a ranging shot. "Down." Tokala pulled Rose low as another shot rang out. "Keep your head down and pump with one hand." He drew his revolver and returned fire. The range was too great for accuracy, but it forced the riders to slow. The trestle at Jackrabbit Crossing came into view, a spindly construction of timber and iron, spanning a gorge where the creek plunged between sheer rock walls. It was 100 feet long, 60 feet above the water, swaying in the wind. Several support beams had been damaged by the flood. "We have to cross that." Rose stared in horror. No choice. The handcar rolled onto the trestle. Immediately, Rose felt the structure shift, timbers groaning. Through gaps in the planking, she could see the creek far below, a roaring torrent. Halfway across, a rotted timber gave way. The car lurched, tilted, and Rose felt herself sliding toward the edge. Tokala's hand shot out, catching her wrist. He hauled her back with one powerful motion, his other hand locked around the handcar's frame. For 3 terrible seconds, they hung there, Rose dangling over empty space. "Climb," he gritted out. "Use me." Rose got her free hand on his shoulder, then his belt, then the handcar. She hauled herself back, gasping. "Pump," almost across. They pumped with everything left. The handcar lurched forward. Behind them, the riders reached the near end and dismounted, unwilling to trust their horses to the failing structure. Bison Bill stood at the trestle's entrance, rifle raised. "End of the line. Throw down the ledger." "Go to hell," Rose shouted back. Bill fired. The bullet whined past Tokala's ear. He returned fire, but the swaying trestle made aiming impossible. They reached the far side. Tokala grabbed Rose and pulled her off the handcar, away from the edge. "The supports," he muttered. "If we can collapse it, they can't follow." Rose pulled her revolver and aimed at the nearest iron bracket. Together. They fired simultaneously. One bracket shattered. They fired again. A second bracket gave way with a metallic shriek. The beam sagged. Bill's men saw what was happening and charged onto the trestle. "No," Bill roared. "Get back. Too late." Tokala and Rose fired their last shots. A third bracket shattered. The main support gave way. The center section collapsed into the gorge, taking 3 of Bill's men with it. Their screams were brief. The survivors scrambled back, staring in shock. Bill stood at the edge, his face purple with rage. "You're dead," he screamed. Tokala turned away, reloading. Rose sagged against a boulder, her breath coming in sobs. 3 men dead. Even if they were killers, the weight of it settled on her shoulders. Tokala's hand found hers. "We had no choice. They would have killed us." "I know. Rose's voice broke. Neither have I. Not directly." He squeezed her hand. "We finish this. For everyone who died in the flood. Come on." They walked away from the collapsed trestle. 4 corners lay ahead, perhaps 5 miles. They made camp that night in an abandoned line shack, too exhausted to continue. Tokala coaxed a small fire, while Rose checked the documents still dry in their wrapping. Tokala produced a piece of dried venison from his pouch and divided it in half. "Your share," he said. "We should split it equal." "We are." It was a lie, his stomach growled, but he wouldn't budge. Outside, night settled. Inside, firelight cast dancing shadows. Rose studied Tokala's face, the scar, the strong bones, the eyes that held depths of experience. "Why are you helping me with this?" she asked quietly. "It's not your fight." Tokala stared into the fire. "My people have been fighting land thieves like Mallory for 50 years. Men who take what isn't theirs, who use law and violence to steal from those weaker. Someone has to stand against it. Might as well be me." "That's not the only reason," Rose said softly. His mouth quirked. "No, it's not." He held her gaze, and Rose felt heat climb her cheeks. Then he looked away. "Get some rest. Tomorrow we face whatever comes." Rose lay down near the fire. Despite exhaustion, sleep came slowly. When it arrived, she dreamed of water and drowning of hands, pulling her under and up, of a voice saying her name like it meant something important. She woke in the deep hours before dawn to find Tokala sitting against the wall, revolver across his lap, keeping watch. His eyes were closed, but he stirred when she moved. "Sleep," Rose whispered. "Let me watch." He studied her, then nodded slowly. "Wake me if you hear anything." He stretched out near the fire, and within minutes, his breathing deepened. Rose sat with her back against the door, the revolver in her lap, and thought about the man sleeping near the fire. She was falling for him. Against all reason, in the middle of catastrophe, she was falling. And she had no idea what to do about it. They reached Four Corners by midday. The town was larger than Fire Creek, 200 buildings, a proper courthouse of red brick with white columns. The territorial flag snapped in the wind above it. They went straight to Judge Blackwell's chambers. The judge was in his 60s with iron-gray hair and piercing blue eyes. He listened in silence as Rose and Tokala laid out their evidence, the ledger showing the explosives and pre-filed claims, Sabrina's copy of the bribery documentation, their testimony. When they finished, Blackwell studied the documents, his expression unreadable. Then he looked up. If this is accurate, and I've no reason to doubt it, Frank Mallory is guilty of sabotage, fraud, bribery, and mass murder. That's a hanging offense. He reached for his pen. I'll issue a warrant immediately. Marshal Cord. A weathered man entered Tin Star on his vest. Cord had the look of someone who'd seen everything. Blackwell handed him the warrant. Find Frank Mallory. Bring him in, alive if possible. He'll run, Cord said. Then don't give him time. Move fast. We're going with you, Rose said. Blackwell frowned. Miss Harper, you've done enough. We saw what he did. We pulled bodies from the water. We're going. Tokala nodded. Blackwell sighed. On your heads. But stay back. This is law business. They rode out within the hour, Cord, 6 deputies, and Rose and Tokala. They reached Frank's ranch by late afternoon. The place was eerily quiet. No hands visible. The main house's windows were dark. Cord approached cautiously. Frank Mallory, Marshal Cord with a warrant. Come out peaceable. Silence. Cord kicked the door open and went in fast. 5 minutes later, he emerged grim. Gone. Cleared out. House is ransacked. Where? Rose demanded. If I were him, Sawyer's Bluff railhead. Get on a train and disappear. Cord swung into his saddle. 10 miles west. Ride hard. They rode like fury itself chased them. The sun sank toward the horizon, painting the sky blood red. Sawyer's Bluff came into view, a rail depot, where the line crossed a deep canyon on a massive iron trestle. And there on the trestle, Rose saw figures loading crates onto a handcar. At the center, unmistakable even from distance, was Frank Mallory. His bulk wrapped in a traveling coat, a valise in one hand. Bison Bill stood beside him with 2 other hired guns. There, Rose pointed. Stop Marshall's posse. Cord spurred forward. Bill opened fire. His first shot took a deputy in the shoulder, spinning him from his saddle. The posse scattered, taking cover, trading shots. Frank and his men fled onto the trestle, using the ironwork and crates for cover. Cord's men advanced, but couldn't get a clear shot. We need to flank them, Tokala said. He pointed to a narrow trail leading down into the canyon. There's a catwalk under the trestle. If we get below, we cut off their escape. Too dangerous, Cord said. So is letting them escape. Tokala looked at Rose. You don't have to come. Like hell. Rose checked her revolver. We finish this. Together. They slipped away and descended the treacherous trail. The maintenance catwalk was a narrow iron walkway suspended beneath the trestle's main span, barely 2 feet wide with a single cable handrail. Below, the canyon dropped 70 feet to boulders and rushing water. Rose's stomach lurched as she stepped onto it. The catwalk swayed with every movement. Wind whipped through the canyon, but she gripped the cable and moved forward 1 foot at a time, not looking down. Behind her, Tokala moved with balanced grace. They edged along, working beneath the trestle's center section, where Frank's men were pinned. Above, Frank's voice carried, Get across and blow it. They can't follow if there's no bridge. Rose and Tokala reached a ladder leading up through the ironwork to rail level. They climbed carefully, emerging behind stacked crates. Frank and Bill were 30 feet away, crouched behind girders, firing at Cord's men. They hadn't seen Rose and Tokala yet. "Drop your weapons." Tokala stepped out, revolver leveled. Frank spun his face, contorting with rage. He had a pistol and fired without hesitation. The bullet whined past Rose's head, missing by inches. She returned fire, her shot sparking off the girder beside Frank. Bill charged at Tokala, swinging his rifle like a club. Tokala ducked under the swing, drove his shoulder into Bill's gut, and they went down in a tangle, rolling dangerously close to the trestle's edge, grappling for dominance. Frank lunged at Rose, grabbing for the ledger still tucked in her coat. "Give it here." Rose twisted away, bringing her revolver up, but Frank was surprisingly fast. He caught her wrist and twisted viciously. Pain shot up her arm. The ledger fell tumbling toward the edge. "No." Rose dove for it, her fingers closing on one corner just as it started to slide through the gap. Frank kicked at her ribs hard enough to drive breath from her lungs. She gasped, holding the ledger with one hand and the trestle's edge with the other, her body half hanging over empty space. Frank raised his boot to stomp on her fingers. Time seemed to slow. Rose saw it coming, the boot descending, her fingers about to be crushed, the ledger about to fall, everything they'd fought for about to be lost. And she made a choice. She let go of the edge, swinging her free hand up with a revolver she'd somehow kept gripped. Frank's boot came down on empty wood as Rose pulled the trigger. The shot took him in the thigh. He howled, stumbling backward. Rose hauled herself up with strength born of desperation, the ledger clutched to her chest, and fired again. This shot hit center mass. Frank's eyes went wide with shock and disbelief. He staggered backward one step too, his boot finding empty air where a plank had rotted away. He teetered for one endless moment, arms windmilling, then fell. His scream echoed through the canyon for 3 long seconds before cutting off abruptly with a distant, sickening crunch. Rose collapsed on the trestle, gasping, still clutching the ledger. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely hold it. Tokala had subdued Bill with a chokehold and threw him toward Cord, who snapped cuffs on the foreman. The other 2 gunmen, seeing their boss dead and leader captured, dropped their weapons and surrendered. Tokala knelt beside Rose, his hands gentle as he helped her sit up. Blood dripped from a cut on his forehead, but his eyes were clear and focused on her. "Are you hurt?" "No. Bruised, but..." She looked at the ledger, miraculously intact. "We did it. It's over." "It's over," he agreed quietly. Rose looked up at his face, seeing exhaustion and relief and something else, something warm and deep that made her breath catch. Without thinking, she leaned forward and pressed her forehead against his. "Thank you," she whispered. "For everything. For believing me when I sounded crazy. For staying with me, for..." "You fought as hard as I did," he interrupted gently. "Harder. You're the one who figured it out. You're the one who shot him when it mattered. We fought together." "Together," he agreed. His hand came up, cupping the back of her head gently. For a moment, suspended above the canyon with wind whistling through ironwork, they stayed like that, 2 people who'd found each other in catastrophe and forged something unbreakable. Then Cord's voice, "Harper, Tokala, need statements." They pulled apart, climbed to their feet, and walked back across the trestle together. The trial was swift. Judge Blackwell reconvened court within 2 days, and the evidence was overwhelming. The ledger's testimony from Rose, Tokala, Sabrina, and dozens of survivors, the confession of 1 captured gunman, all pointed to one inescapable conclusion. Frank Mallory, deceased, had engineered a catastrophe for profit. His accomplices, Bison Bill Commissioner Wendell captured fleeing to Kansas, and 3 others were guilty of conspiracy to commit murder. The jury deliberated 30 minutes. Guilty on all counts. Bill was sentenced to hang. Wendell got 20 years hard labor. Justice, such as it was, had been served. But the cost had been terrible. 43 people dead, over 100 injured, dozens of homesteads destroyed. Rose threw herself into recovery work, helping Doc Pike at his clinic. She tended wounds, dosed fevers, held the hands of the dying, delivered 2 babies in the chaos. Tokala stayed close, organizing work parties to clear debris and rebuild homes. His knowledge proved invaluable, and settlers who'd viewed him with suspicion came to respect him deeply. Lars Jensen found Rose one afternoon. He held Ulrika's hand and the girl clutching a donated rag doll. "My Ulrika lives because of you," Lars said, voice thick with emotion. "My Ingrid is gone, but my daughter is here. I owe you everything." Rose shook her head. "You owe Tokala. He came through the flood. I owe you both." Lars gripped her hand. "If you ever need anything, you call on me." "Just rebuild," Rose said gently. "That's what we all need." Sabrina visited with news. "Wendell's replacement is honest. The territorial governor is investigating land fraud across the region. Frank's empire is being broken up and redistributed." She smiled faintly. "You started something, Rose Harper." 8 weeks after the flood, Rose stood on the ridge above what would become the new Harper Jensen homestead. The land was recovering grass, greening birds, returning the creek back within its banks. The surprise had come from Judge Blackwell himself, delivered in a letter Abraham read aloud with shaking hands. Upon investigation, numerous claims were never properly filed. Mr. Mallory pocketed fees and left deeds unrecorded. Under disaster relief statutes, I hereby award the following in joint ownership. To the Harper and Jensen families, 320 acres, in sections 11 to 12, free and clear of all encumbrances. 320 acres, joint ownership, free and clear. Abraham had wept. Greta had prayed. Lars had grabbed Abraham in a bear hug. Now Rose walked the property line, imagining the future. She heard hoofbeats and turned. Tokala rode his paint horse up the slope, moving with easy grace. He wore new buckskins, a gift from the Lakota Council, and his braids were freshly wrapped. "Your family is settled?" he asked. "Getting there. The house will be finished before first snow." Rose paused, suddenly shy. "What about you? I heard you took survey work." "West to the Bighorn Mountains, mapping new routes, paying $3 a day." He looked out over the land. "I leave in 4 days." Rose's heart sank. Of course he was leaving. He had his own life. "That's good. You've earned it." "Rose." He said her name quietly, and something in his tone made her look up. "I came to ask you something." "What?" He met her eyes, and she saw uncertainty, vulnerability she'd never seen before. "When I return, if I return because the mountains are dangerous, would you be willing to see me again, not as strangers thrown together by disaster, but as more, if you wanted?" Rose felt her breath catch. She thought of everything they'd been through, the flood, the desperate flight, the trestle confrontation. The way he'd shielded her, given her his coat and food, risked his life again and again. The quiet strength in his voice when he said her name. The way his hand felt in hers. "I would," she said softly. "I'd like that very much." Relief flooded his face. He stepped closer, and Rose stepped to meet him. They stood inches apart, and his hand rising to touch her cheek with tentative gentleness, her hand finding his chest where she could feel his heartbeat. "I'll come back," he promised. "I give you my word. I'll be here." He raised her hand to his lips, a brief, warm press, and then released her and swung onto his horse. He looked down at her for one long moment, memorizing her face, then turned and rode toward the setting sun. Rose stood watching until he was just a speck on the horizon, her hand pressed where her heart was doing strange, wonderful things. 4 months later, as autumn painted the prairie gold and crimson, Rose was mending harness in the new barn when she heard hoofbeats. She looked up, her heart leaping, and saw Tokala riding up the track. He was thinner, weathered by mountain months, but his eyes were bright and his smile rare, as diamonds was real. "You came back," Rose said, dropping the harness and walking out to meet him. "I said I would." He dismounted, suddenly awkward in a way he'd never been during the flood. "The survey work's done. I have money saved, and He paused, gathering words. "I filed a claim, adjoining yours. 160 acres properly registered, if that's acceptable to you and your family." Rose stared at the folded deed he pulled from his coat and then at his face. "You're staying here." "If you want me to. I know we're from different worlds. You're a settler's daughter and I'm Lakota, and that makes things complicated. People will talk. But I thought maybe—" He trailed off, uncertainty flickering. "If you still wanted—" Rose didn't let him finish. She stepped forward and kissed him, her hands fisting in his shirt, all careful frontier propriety evaporating. He froze in surprise for a heartbeat. Then his arms came around her, pulling her close, kissing her back with fervor that stole her breath. When they broke apart, both breathing hard, eyes wide, Tokala smiled, a genuine smile that transformed his face. "I'll take that as a yes," he said. "That's a yes," Rose confirmed, laughing. "To the claim to staying, to all of it. Yes." He rested his forehead against hers, his hands cradling her face. "I can't promise it'll be easy, but I promise I'll build you a good house, work the land, and stand by you through whatever comes. I know you will, because that's who you are." They stood together on the ridge, overlooking the valley wind, stirring their hair, the prairie stretching vast and golden. Behind them, the Harper Jensen homestead bustled, Abraham and Lars framing a barn, Greta and Maria hanging laundry, Clara and Ulrika playing with puppies. Ahead on Tokala's claim, the land waited raw, empty, full of promise. Together, they would build something there. A house, a life, a partnership forged in catastrophe and tempered by choice. "Come on," Rose said, taking his hand. "I want to introduce you properly to Papa, as my intended." Intended? The word seemed to please him. "Yes, I like that." They walked down the slope, hand in hand, toward the homestead, toward family and future, and the hard, good work of building a life on the frontier. The flood had taken much, but it had given them this, each other, and the chance to create something new from the ruins of the old. And as the sun set over Bitter Creek Valley, painting the sky in shades of hope and promise, Rose Harper knew with absolute certainty that she was exactly where she belonged.